Now we're going to talk about the rib and the chuck. We've broken it down into more pieces that you're going to recognize. This is the rib that we're going to start with, and it's got the bone attached to it right now, but it's actually cut off, so I'm going to kind of go over the different parts, and then you'll end up with something that you're going to recognize. These pieces of muscle that are on the top of the rib are called rib cap meat, and so we pull those off, and primarily those are going to be used for lean trim for ground beef, or they can be used for stew. You can see they're kind of porous and not really great to make steaks, but really a lot of flavor. There's a lot of flavor in the chuck. So this is the rib with the bones on it, and then we just basically take a knife. The chine has come off, the part of the spine that you can't put a knife through. A lot of times you'll see a rib in a store with the bones on it, and most of those are cut so you can get a knife in between the bones. But then you pull this off, and this is a back rib, which is a great item for barbecue or for slow roasting. Makes an excellent smoking item too. But then what you wind up with is a boneless ribeye that you can either roast or cut into steaks. The ribeye is the area that the meat graders use to grade the beef. So the amount of marbling is usually looked at from the ribeye. So the marbling are the little white flecks of meat. And it's a very tender, very tasty piece of meat. So then that's what we have is a boneless ribeye, and you can cut that like a loaf of bread into steaks or roast the whole thing or cut it into larger pieces and roast it. So now we're going to move into the chuck. So then we've got the chuck broken out into a lot more pieces. The chuck is a little bit bigger piece, but the primary eye of the chuck is the chuck eye roast, or a chuck roast that you see a lot of times in the supermarket. And then there's the eye of the muscle. You can see it looks a lot like the ribeye. That's because it's basically the other side of the rib. The rib would attach like that. So this is the front of the animal, and this is the chuck. But there's a lot of different muscles in there, and they don't make good steaks. You could maybe get one or two steaks off of this side that are pretty decent steaks, but the rest of it needs to be roasted or braised, or you could pull it apart and use the various cuts to make stew meat or braising cuts. So that's the chuck roll. Also, on the back side, on the other side of the arm bone, is the shoulder. And the shoulder we pulled off as a big piece of muscle. And then this you may have heard of flat iron steaks. These are flat iron fillets, and basically what it is it's a whole muscle. You put it back together like that, clean off all the connective tissue, and you pretty much fillet it like a fish. You open it up. There's a big line of heavy connective tissue goes down the center, and so you clean all that out, and you wind up with two flank-like pieces of meat that are very tender and very, very tasty. This is the second most tender muscle in the animal. So flat iron steaks are very popular, and you can either grill the whole thing and slice it thin like a flank steak, or you can cut it into individual steaks. Very popular restaurant cut. Also part of the chuck is the short rib, and this is a boneless short rib out of the chuck side of the plate, or the bottom part, where we saw near the sternum or near the chest. This is short rib. You can see there's a lot of connective tissue in this. So this is a tough piece of meat to eat as a grilled steak. But what happens when you slow cook this or braise this, all this connective tissue turns to gelatin and makes a delicious, tender, moist short rib. Short rib is one of my favorite meals. Also part of that shoulder, this is a new cut that probably a lot of you may not have heard of. Most restaurants have heard of it. It's been around a few years. Of course, it's been in the animal forever. But the shoulder tender, the name of the muscle is a teres major. You'll see it as shoulder tender, petite tender on menus, and you can either make this as a whole steak. It's very tender and very, very flavorful. It's probably as tender as a tenderloin and has a lot more flavor. It's just kind of small. You can cut it into medallions, or you can grill the whole thing as a roast. Also connected to that is the shoulder clawed heart, and this is the shoulder blade or the outside of the shoulder that you see on the animal, and this is a nice roast to make pot roast. A little tough to make steaks, but it makes a great pot roast. Some of the off muscles are made into stew meat that we have, and then, as I said before, this is the cat meat. Also, right along that bone is what's called the mock tender, Scotch tender, and it looks like it would make great steaks, but it's a pretty tough piece of meat. It's something that really needs to be roasted or braised. From that point, we move on to the heavy. This is the rib, short rib. This is what makes bone-in short ribs, and you can either cut it in between the bones and make barbecue-style short ribs, or you can cut it across the bone, make what's called flanken-style short ribs, which are very popular. And this is the boneless, just the boneless section of the chuck part of it. So that's a chuck short rib. And then what we have left is the brisket, the whole brisket after we've cleaned it up. This is something that you're probably used to seeing in the supermarket, the whole brisket. Now sometimes you'll see this in the supermarket cut into two pieces. This is the point and the flat. So a lot of times they just sell the flats, which is a leaner portion that a lot of people are used to seeing, and that's what a lot of people will use, to make the boiled dinners and things like that. But brisket's also great for barbecue. People put it in a smoker for a long time, and it kind of pulls apart more like all these striated muscles as they cook for a long time. They're easy to pull apart. So it makes great barbecue beef. So that is the chuck and the rib.